Have you ever enjoyed a story where the world felt so alive in earlier seasons, but then you dropped it because it increasingly feels like a flat backdrop in later seasons? Or read something where it feels like the world is so meticulously detailed but still feels so shallow? My name is Bonnibel. I do storytelling training and developmental editing services, and I'm also a writer and graphic novelist. And I have identified 3 crucial mistakes writers often make when creating their fictional worlds. And to be clear, this isn't just for fantasy or sci-fi. Worlds here can be as small as a town or a campus or even a house. So stick around because these should apply across all genres. You know this one. You stay up all night for days on end making pages and pages of lore only for it to serve as some kind of historical info dump that does not in any way, shape, or form haunt your characters. Maybe you make a story set in a generic white American neighborhood about, I don't know, a love affair or murder, but then nothing about the town or the neighbors or the school have anything special. You might as well have set the story in Osaka or Surabaya and it won't make a difference. The reason? No ghosts. Breadth isn't depth. You can go very vast in the breadth of your world with full maps and histories and a list of fantasy races and species, but that doesn't guarantee depth. On the other hand, you can focus on one single house but go so deep in the trauma it carries and the way it messes with people's heads that you basically create one of the best horror films of all time. Depth is the realization that the world isn't just a backdrop. It always carries an active force creating winners, losers, and unresolved grievances in the present. Why? Because places hold memories, whether that's a movie theater where a character had their first breakup or the shores of an unassuming small town where decades ago a giant kaiju was discovered. Places hold dreams, a stage where an up-and-coming artist dreams of performing, or broken ones like destinations never visited due to an untimely death. Places are bound by unwritten rules, not just the obvious ones like laws and magic systems, but also power relations, racism, sexism, transphobia, and so on. Maybe the genericness of your American neighborhood setting is the point because you want to explore racism in the most bland town imaginable, in which case it's no longer generic, but deliberately built from the ground up by the theme you're exploring. Ghosts is how you build worlds with identities, a world that's inseparable not only from the external journey your characters go through, but it's an active dialogue with their internal conflict and eventual growth. The number one question you should ask when evaluating your world: does my story still work if it takes place in an entirely different setting? If the answer is yes, you're probably doing something wrong. A caveat to this: one might argue The Lion King has the same story as Hamlet, but while it may have the same plot threads and same elements, Hamlet is still not The Lion King. It doesn't talk about the circle of life. It doesn't have singing warthogs and marginalized coyotes. This is why retellings and reinterpretations work. They're not just telling the same story. The world elements, the perspectives, the vibes all contribute to the kind of story you're telling. Because the world is always haunted. Unspoken secrets, unresolved regrets, sins of the fathers, forbidden histories, oppressive power structures. Channel your world's ghosts before fleshing out their details. So, now your world comes with social and psychological dynamics that actively haunt and shape your characters' fears and motivations, but something still doesn't feel quite right. It feels black and white. Evil people are evil just because. Morally gray characters are boring for whatever reason. The reason? No worldviews. You've been building your character's moral compass on the fly. This character believes this set of values because that's just the way they are, and this other character believes in a different set of values because their paths need to come across at some point and you need a justification for them to do certain things when they meet. I see this a lot in romance stories where 2 characters fall in love because the writer simply wants them to fall in love, and they're both good looking and fans love them, so why not? In reality, there would be absolutely no reason for this sort of relationship to work out, but logic gets thrown out the window because it's not that deep. To me, this sits on the same level as clashes between characters because one party wants to destroy the world and the other wants to defend it. Yes, your story might work, but don't you want to explore a little deeper? Obviously, your meet cute does not have to involve a discussion on Feuerbach Thesis 11, but the weight of your alignments and conflicts always comes from how these characters see the world. Two people fall in love because they enhance what each other believes or wants to believe about the world and themselves. And two people fight, sometimes to death, sometimes starting all-out wars, because of a fundamental difference in how they see the world and what ought to be done with it. You've probably heard a lot about giving a character's backstories to motivate them in one way or another, but what I don't see enough people talking about is how these backstories need to have the same world logic. This is what makes worlds consistent and character arcs believable. Two characters can both be victims of racism but respond to it in different ways. Or they start off seeing the world in a certain way and end up seeing it in another way at the end. Two characters can initially see something in the same way, fall in love, but eventually fall out of love because they've undergone different arcs. Or two characters can start off very much opposed, but through circumstances, come to see the world in a similar way and share the same dream. This is the anime villain that turns into an ally in the second season, or it can be the backbone of your enemies to lovers story, same architecture. What about internal conflicts? Same thing. A character's worldview crumbles maybe because of some new information or maybe because they're forced to choose between two good things. Side note, people say don't make your characters too good or they'll become a Mary Sue, and readers will get bored. This advice never really sat right with me because it assumes an objective sense of good and evil. A character with the same good set of values can become a courageous figure of hope, a tragic martyr, or a suffocating moral absolutist, depending on where you place them in relation to the worldview of other characters in your story and what kind of conflict it generates. It always goes back to the material conditions of your world and how each of your key characters see it. If you want them to work together or fall in love, make a scene where it's undeniable that they have compatible ways of looking at the world, maybe different, but desirable for each other nonetheless. If you want them to fight or eventually fall out, make this drift apparent in the changes they notice about the world around them. Fantastic! Now your world not only comes with social and psychological dynamics that actively haunt and shape your character's fears and motivations, but you've properly situated each character's alignment, conflict, and growth based on the specific worldviews your world has engendered within it. But oops, your readers get confused, they get mad. They expected the story to go in one direction, but it went in a completely different direction, and not in a good way. They're saying plot holes, but you don't understand where the hole is. They're saying they don't like the power system and characters are getting too OP and the stakes are getting not realistic anymore, but why? There's a good chance you forgot to ground your stakes. This happens when you set the rules of your world, its history, and all the different worldviews of the various factions, but you can't decide how much of the world can actually be changed throughout the course of the story. The stakes your characters are risking are ungrounded from the design of your world. The question, is your story about changing the world? Or is it about accepting the futility of any attempts to change the world? Or maybe it's somewhere in between. Change, but only within a small community. Or change, but with a dire, tragic cost that makes you question whether it was all worth it to begin with. If you don't decide in advance how much of the world can be changed and in which direction you're taking the story, you risk running into major headaches down the line. Your stakes will start to feel inconsistent, too little or too forced. Sometimes they may not be literal plot holes, but things can still feel like a plot hole when you start out establishing a bleak world that's impossible to change, only to introduce a device that makes the reader wonder, why didn't we just use that back then? Or maybe you're giving the impression that your protagonist will change the world, only to have an overpowered obstacle come out of nowhere at the last minute, making the reader feel duped this entire time. Another caveat: this latter technique is part of Diabolus ex machina, and when used intentionally can actually be very powerful and thematically resonant. So as always, take all of these points of advice with a grain of salt. When you have decided on a consistent spectrum of change your world can go through, then you can start defining the stakes and outlining the trials and tribulation your characters go through before achieving or failing to achieve this change. So, to recap, my method of building worlds that really matter are as follows. Start with the ghosts. Drawing a world map or some huge historical lore about your fantasy world can be cool and all, but they will remain flat unless you haunt the world itself with scars and unresolved problems. Let these ghosts shape your characters' worldviews, and let those worldviews shape your conflicts. Forget good and evil and ambiguous morals. Focus on what kind of worldviews logically follows the ghosts of your world, and let them clash. And finally, ground the stakes of these clashes in the logic of your world. Decide early on what kind of story you're telling in terms of the changes that will be possible in your world. The next step is to edit. There are 3 parts to this. First, behind every detail, a scene exposition, a character dialogue, and so on. Ask yourself, what political, social, or historical function does it illustrate? Sometimes it simply moves the plot along, or sometimes it just vibes, and both are okay. But if you can make the details serve the world building in a deep way, you're gonna go a long way. Second, are there enough objects that illustrate all of the logic you've built? Objects can embody the priorities, technology, and conflicts of the era that made it. And so can their destruction and decay. What characters carry, wear, or use can tell us their place in the world and their values. And what they want to do with certain objects can crystallize their conflict of worldviews. Third, is your world open-ended enough with its meaning and interpretation? If you're so driven by a certain set of values and you have one worldview you champion above all others, your work might come across as cringe, preachy, or on the nose, even when you've successfully avoided all of those mistakes. I believe the purpose of a story is to foster open-ended dialogue via empathy, even when it's a bleak tragedy. I go into a lot more detail on this in my other video, where I analyze One Piece and what elements it successfully deploys to launch it into becoming an icon of the 2025 Gen Z revolutions across the world. Go watch it next if you're interested. As always, thanks so much for watching. Like the video if you did, and I'll see you in the next one.